Scripture is always contextual. If we fail to understand the context of anything we read in the Bible, then we have a high chance of misunderstanding the teaching that it offers us. Typically, we have to do a lot of research to understand the context in which the Scripture was written, to understand the words and the setting and what it all meant to the people who originally said it and what's happening. These are stories that come to us from the other side of the world more than 2,000 years ago through at least 4 different languages, if not more. It takes a lot of unpacking to get at the heart of these teachings a lot of the time. But sometimes our real problem is not understanding the context of the Scriptures, but understanding our context, the context of our own lives and our society. And that gets in the way of us hearing the proper teaching that still applies even after 2,000 years. Today's Scripture is a solid example of this. None of the words are unclear. Jesus is simply standing before a crowd and talking. There's no outdated rituals or way of life that we don't fully understand because anthropology hasn't caught up to us yet. It's very basic. He stands, he talks, he uses very plain language. And it's really a list of Christianity's greatest hits. Turn the other cheek. Give the shirt off your back. Go that extra mile. These are all very familiar teachings in our faith tradition, and yet they are often misunderstood, enabling people to remain victims in unjust situations or to allow ourselves to remain complicit in unjust systems. Jesus offers these teachings that are meant to dismantle violence and injustice, and yet we turn them into excuses for getting punched without punching back, or wasting our lives as suffering servants. Without contextual understanding, we can't grasp the proper teaching that these words have to offer us. And in this case, the context of the Scripture is clear, and the context of our lives and our culture is less so. I graduated from Andover Newton Theological School, and there's a professor there named Mark Heim, and he is our systematic theology guru, and he has written extensively about the city of Athens in the 4th century BCE. At that time, the city was known as Pericles, and it was a flourishing artistic center. This was the time of Aristotle. This was the century that introduced the world to the great gifts of the Greek culture, art and literature and architecture and poetry. These were the people who built the Parthenon. And during this time of great discovery and invention, in the city of Pericles, there was a special jail full of prisoners for the express purpose of bringing them out into the city during times of crisis. If the community was facing impending hardship that might lead them to war with a neighboring city-state, they would take one of these prisoners out of the jail, and the city would gather around to beat and flog and eventually kill one of these prisoners. It's a system, a ritual that we now have a term for. We call it scapegoating. That's what it means for there to be a scapegoat. Rather than dealing with the hard economic impending doom or whatever kinds of decisions that had to be confronted, folks throughout the world, throughout all of history, have usually taken more comfort in putting all of the blame on one particular scapegoat. And as long as that person can be eliminated from the world, we can go on with our lives and think that everything's going to be okay. Now, the interesting thing about this particular place and this particular system of scapegoating is that the prisoners that were put through this process were referred to as pharmakos, which is derived from the Greek word pharmakon. And if that word sounds familiar to you, it should, because it's the word that gives us words like pharmacy and pharmaceutical. That base word, pharmakon, can be interpreted as both poison and remedy. Now, I'm not convinced that we have evolved much beyond this kind of violent peacekeeping system. The scapegoating pharmakon that I just described earlier, that sounds barbaric and it sounds horrible, and it's nothing we would ever actually condone in our society. But I'm not convinced that we have actually evolved beyond the idea that violence will somehow solve our problems. I was going to stand here in front of you and list for you the violent things and the victims of violence that we've heard about in this last week of our shared lives. But I don't have to do that. The news feeds that to you 24 hours a day. There are stories you know better than I do. There are names you know better than I do. There are statistics you have heard that you know better than I do. And as we hold in our hearts today all the victims and all the situations of violence throughout our world, what I want to point out, what I want to help us focus in on, is the violence that occurs in each and every one of our lives every single day. We are not the victims of gross injustice and physical destruction that we read about and that we see on the news. But violence simply means a sudden, swift force. That's all it means. And based on that definition, we experience violence in our lives in many ways every single day, even if we don't make the news. I've been hurt, and the only recourse I have is to hurt someone else. I've been embarrassed or belittled, so I lash out at a loved one, saying something I don't mean. Or maybe I do mean it, and it's still designed to hurt. I feel offended by what you have to say, so I ignore you, pretend like you don't exist, or discredit you so no one else will believe you. I can't handle the entire complexity of you as a human being, so I give you a name or a label instead. I take away your personhood so that you are less of a threat to me. Your life is too different from mine, so I'm going to make sure you know you are not welcome here. I feel the entire world is attacking me, and I don't belong anywhere. My only recourse is to take my own life before someone else takes it from me. Your political viewpoint is different than mine, so you must be an enemy of my country. We can't count the ways that we attempt to solve our problems through the use of swift and intense force. Usually it's verbally. Usually we are not in physical violent situations, but some of us are. And we can't count the number of ways that we deal with our problems in this swift and intense way. Violence is one word for it. Another word is efficiency. We are efficient people. We don't like complexity, and if there's a problem that's bothering us, we'd just as soon be done with it as simply and orderly as possible. Anthropologists and historians find it easy to look back millennia and document the detailed workings of systems of violence in ancient cultures, but are we capable of being honest about how those same systems function in our lives today? Violence persists in many forms. And while it is the poison that threatens each and every one of us, we also see it as the cure for our problems. The ancient Hebrew teaching of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that began as a way of mitigating revenge. It was to ensure that one particular wrongdoer didn't lead to the destruction of the entire village. But by the time Jesus began teaching his followers, he was already seeing right through the lie of that teaching. The teaching says, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, everything's going to be fine. The lie that Jesus sees through is, if you take my eye from me, and I take your eye, that doesn't help me see any better. That doesn't make me whole. That does not restore me to who I once was. There are many different kinds of violence, and they all wound us. They all scar us. They all make us less than we once were. And repaying the violence that we experience by doing violence to others can't possibly restore us to our former selves, but we like to think that it can. When we are hurt, our first instinct is to hurt someone else, whether they deserve it or not. But Jesus reminds us, as long as we see violence as the cure to our problems, violence will continue to poison us. It's only by understanding the nature of violence that we can also start talking about how to end it. There are many conversations happening throughout our country surrounding gun control and how do we select policies that keep us safe while protecting our freedoms. There are many places that we enter into that dialogue assuming that you are either for health and safety or against freedom. It's an unhelpful, dualistic way of looking at the problem. Jesus offers us a third way. Jesus says to us, you are not stuck choosing between being the offender or the offended. You are not limited to the binary choice of lawless chaos or limited freedom. In our scripture today, Jesus has news for us that is actually more challenging than anything else we can hear. It's that there is a way out, and it is not efficient. And it requires you to love your enemy as yourself. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist. Be generous. Give to all who ask of you. Love your enemy. As long as our mindset is geared toward retaliation and revenge, then violence begets violence. But in our lesson today, Jesus shows us what the true antidote for violence is. It's reconciliation. Jesus demonstrates that the antidote to violence is not peace, but healing. If someone has made you their enemy, become their friend. Now, is this easy? No. Is it efficient? Not in any way, shape, or form. It asks for a lot of risk without any guarantee of reward. It requires vulnerability without any promise of restitution. It's a teaching that asks us to ignore our most basic desires and impulses. Is it impossible? Absolutely not. Jesus himself showed us what this looks like. When his foreign occupiers and his own kinsmen teamed up to put him to humiliating death on the cross, what did Jesus do? He didn't fight back, but he didn't go quietly either. He prayed. He prayed for everyone involved. Now that may seem meaningless. He still lost his life. He still died. But within one generation of his death, Romans and Jews, Gentiles, slaves and free people, men and women, all sat around the same table, saying to one another, you are a beloved child of God. We each have the power to perpetuate the cycle of violence, to continue trying to cure ourselves with our own illness over and over again. But God has also blessed us with the creative power of love. Love that can heal wounds. Love that can reconcile, literally bring together again. You may have heard it said that this isn't your job, that there are others who are supposed to take care of this. We have systems and services meant to protect us and solve our problems. But I say to each and every one of you, Pharmakon. Each and every one of us is wounded, broken, infected by violence, which means that every and each one of us can also be the cure to what ails us. Thanks be to God.